Orphanages and group homes are supposed to be places of refuge, a safe haven for those who have nowhere else to go. But old buildings have a way of holding on to things, memories, energies, or sometimes something much darker. In tonight's video, we will be looking at 3 allegedly true horror stories submitted by viewers who spent time in the system. These stories prove that sometimes the scariest thing isn't being alone, it's realizing that you aren't. Sit back, hide your snacks, and let's get into it. I grew up in the foster system in Ohio, bouncing between different families for most of my childhood. It wasn't great, but it was what it was. However, for a brief period in the winter of 1998, I was sent to stay at a strictly religious orphanage out in the countryside. This building was ancient, massive, Victorian style. It looked like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. It had creaky floorboards that groaned every time you took a step, and the draft in the winter was so bad you could see your breath in the hallways. We slept in a large dormitory on the 2nd floor. The place was run by a head matron named Mrs. Gable. She was a stern woman, old school. Every single night at 9 p.m. sharp, she would do a head count. She would walk slowly down the center aisle, whispering the numbers under her breath. 1, 2, 3. Once she hit 20, she would turn off the main lights, and we were expected to be asleep. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. I had to use the bathroom badly. The bathrooms were all the way down at the other end of the long hallway outside the dorm. The hallway at night was terrifying, poorly lit, shadows stretching across the walls like long, grasping fingers. But eventually the urge was too strong. I climbed out of bed. The floorboards were treacherous. I slipped into the hallway. It was pitch black except for the moonlight filtering through a dusty window at the far end. As I walked back toward the dorm, I had to pass the main stairwell. This stairwell connected the 2nd floor to the 3rd floor. Now we were strictly forbidden from going to the 3rd floor. Mrs. Gable told us the floorboards were rotted, unsafe. So naturally we stayed away, but as I passed the landing I heard something. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was a rhythmic sound. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded exactly like a rubber ball bouncing on wood. I slowly turned my head to look up the stairs. It was an abyss of darkness up there. "Hello?" I whispered. "Is someone up there?" The bouncing stopped immediately. Silence. The kind of heavy silence that rings in your ears. I stood there for what felt like forever, my hand gripping the wooden banister, my knuckles turning white. I convinced myself to turn around and go back to bed, but just as I turned my body away, a voice drifted down from the darkness. It was a raspy, dry whisper, like someone who hadn't used their voice in days. It said one word, 21. My blood turned to ice. There were only 20 of us. I didn't ask who's there. I bolted. I ran back to the dorm room so fast I almost tripped over my own feet. I dove under my covers and lay there shaking for hours, listening to every creak of the house. 2 days later, the police found a man living in the crawl space of the 3rd floor, a drifter. He had set up a small sleeping area directly above our dormitory, but the most disturbing part was what the police found in the floorboards. He had drilled a small hole through the wood, looking directly down into our sleeping quarters. The police said he had a notebook with him. In it, he had been keeping a log of our schedule. And every night after Mrs. Gable did her rounds, he would do his own head count, just to make sure we were all there. This happened about 5 years ago. I was 24 at the time, working as a night supervisor at a residential group home for troubled youth in rural Oregon. It wasn't exactly an orphanage in the traditional sense, but it functioned the same way. It was a place for kids who had nowhere else to go, usually waiting for foster placement or aging out of the system. The facility was located miles from civilization, surrounded by thick, suffocating pine woods on all sides. The nearest town was a 20-minute drive down a winding, unlit road. The building itself was a large, sprawling single-story structure shaped like a giant U, with a central courtyard that was always pitch black at night. My job was pretty simple. Sit in the main staff office, watch the security monitors, and do a perimeter check of the hallways every hour to make sure the kids were in their rooms. It was usually boring, dead silent work. I'd mostly spend the night reading or scrolling through my phone, listening to the hum of the vending machine in the hall. One night in late November, we were hit by a massive storm. It was one of those storms that shakes the foundation of the building. The rain was hammering against the metal roof so hard it sounded like static interference. Around 3:00 a.m., the power started flickering. The overhead fluorescent lights would buzz loudly, dim to a brown color, and then pop back on. It put everyone on edge. I was sitting in the staff office with my coworker, Dave. Dave was an older guy, a retired cop, who wasn't easily spooked. He He was making coffee in the break room while I watched the monitors. I was staring at the grid of 16 screens, half asleep, when I noticed movement on camera 4. Camera 4 covered the East Wing hallway. Now you have to understand, the East Wing was currently closed off for renovations. There had been a pipe burst a few months prior, so the whole wing was stripped down to the studs. No kids were sleeping in that wing. It was completely empty, just tools, sawdust, and plastic tarps hanging from the ceiling. I squinted at the grainy black and white screen. The camera had switched to night vision because the lights in that hallway were off. At the very far end of the hall, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It looked small, like a child. "Hey, Dave," I called out, leaning closer to the monitor. "Come look at this." Dave walked over, blowing on his coffee. "What is it?" "I think one of the kids wandered into the East Wing." "Look." I pointed at the screen. The figure was just standing there, facing the wall. It wasn't moving, it wasn't looking around, just staring at the blank drywall, arms stiff at its sides. "Weird," Dave muttered, frowning. "Probably sleepwalking. The storm probably woke one of them up. Go grab him before he steps on a rusty nail or something." I grabbed my heavy maglite flashlight and the radio. "All right, I'm going in." I left the safety of the office and walked down the main corridor. The atmosphere changed as soon as I got close to the East Wing. The air got noticeably colder, and the smell of the place shifted from lemon cleaner to that distinct, earthy scent of damp wood and drywall dust. I reached the plastic sheeting that separated the renovation zone from the rest of the building. I pushed through it, the plastic making a loud, crinkling sound that echoed down the empty hall like a gunshot. "Hello?" I called out softly. "It's time to go back to bed." The hallway was pitch black. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam down the length of the corridor. The beam caught particles of dust floating in the air. The figure was still there, standing at the very end about 40 feet away. As I started walking toward him, I began to notice details that didn't sit right. It looked like a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He was wearing what looked like oversized, old-fashioned pajamas, the kind with buttons all the way up the front. We didn't issue pajamas like that. The kids usually slept in t-shirts and shorts. I got within 20 feet. The rain was pounding on the roof, making it hard to hear my own footsteps. "Buddy, can you hear me?" I said, raising my voice slightly to be heard over the storm. The boy didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, facing the corner. A feeling of heavy dread started to pool in my stomach. "You know that primal instinct that tells you to turn around and run?" It was screaming at me. Why wasn't he responding? Why was he standing so rigid? I stopped walking about 10 feet away. I shined the light directly on his back. "Hey," I said, my voice wavering, "turn around." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the boy began to turn his head. It wasn't a natural movement. It was jerky, like a machine with rusty gears. I braced myself, expecting to see one of the kids I knew, maybe crying or confused. But when the beam of my flashlight hit his face, my heart stopped cold in my chest. His face was wrong. It was smooth, too smooth. It looked like melted wax or a porcelain doll that had been left in the sun. The features were blurred. Where his eyes should have been, there were just slight, shallow indentations in the skin. No eyebrows, no eyelashes, just smooth, pale flesh. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My brain couldn't process what I was looking at. Then, the thing's jaw dropped open. And I don't mean it opened like a human mouth. It opened way too wide, unhinging like a snake, revealing a throat that seemed to go down forever. Inside, it was just an endless black hole. From that open maw came a sound I will never forget. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry. It was a high-pitched electronic static noise, like a radio rapidly tuning between stations, growing louder and louder. Kazard, kazzt. The lights in the hallway flashed once, a bright, blinding strobe, and for a split second, the boy wasn't 10 feet away anymore. He was 5 feet away. I didn't think. I reacted. I stumbled backward, tripping over a paint can and crashing onto the dusty floor. My flashlight rolled away, the beam spinning wildly across the walls. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the light, and pointed it back at the corner, ready to fight for my life. The hallway was empty. The boy was gone. There was nowhere he could have gone. The windows were boarded up with plywood, and I was blocking the only exit. I didn't investigate. I turned and sprinted back to the office, my chest heaving, not daring to look back. I burst through the door, pale as a ghost, nearly knocking Dave over. "Whoa, what happened?" Dave asked, setting his coffee down. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I told him what I saw. I told him about the face, the static, the way it moved. I expected him to laugh or tell me I was crazy, but he didn't. He got very quiet. He walked over to the window and looked out at the storm. "You know," he said quietly, "before this place was a group home. Back in the 70s, this building was a long-term care facility for burn victims. Children mostly. There was a fire in the East Wing that killed 3 patients. I felt sick. We went back and checked the security footage on camera 4. The video showed me walking down the hall, talking to the air. There was no one else in the footage. I was talking to an empty corner, but right before I ran, you could see the camera glitch. A wave of static distortion that washed over the screen for exactly 1 second. I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. I put in my 2 weeks' notice the next morning. I never went back to the East Wing again. I spent most of my childhood in an orphanage in the UK. The building itself was a converted hospital from the 1920s, so it had that sterile, institutional vibe that never really goes away no matter how much you paint the walls. It always smelled faintly of bleach and boiled cabbage. One of the things we had to do to earn our keep was chores. We had a rotation, kitchen duty, sweeping the halls, and the worst one, laundry duty. The laundry room was located in the sub-basement. It was a massive concrete room filled with industrial washers and dryers that were constantly humming. To get there, you had to walk down a long, poorly lit flight of stairs that felt like descending into a dungeon. The air down there was always thick and humid, clinging to your skin. It was easily 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. I was 14 at the time. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and it was my turn on the rotation. I went down there alone with a basket of towels. It was pouring rain outside, a typical gloomy English day. The basement was partially underground, but it had these high, narrow windows along the top of the wall. They were at ground level outside. If you looked up through them, all you could see were weeds, the wet pavement, and occasionally the shoes of people walking by on the sidewalk. I hated being down there alone. The dryers were so loud that you couldn't hear if someone walked up behind you. I kept checking over my shoulder, feeling like eyes were on me. I was standing at one of the metal folding tables, my back to the windows, folding a stack of white sheets. The only sound was the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the dryers and the rain hitting the glass. I was about halfway done when I heard a distinct sound. Tap. Tap. It came from the window behind me. I paused, holding a sheet in midair. I waited. Nothing. I assumed it was just a branch hitting the glass in the wind, or maybe a pebble kicked up by a car. I went back to folding, trying to ignore the creeping feeling on the back of my neck. A few seconds later, it happened again. Louder this time, more deliberate. Tap. 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 I turned around and looked up at the window. The glass was grimy and covered in rain, making it hard to see clearly. But pressed against the glass, I saw a face. My heart jumped into my throat. It was a man. He was lying on the ground outside, peering in through the ground-level window. He had a wide, frantic smile on his face that showed too many teeth. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring right down at me. His forehead was pressed so hard against the glass that the skin was white. I took a step back, my skin crawling. I didn't recognize him. I figured it was some drunk or a creep from town getting his kicks scaring kids. We had issues with peeping Toms before. I decided the best thing to do was ignore him. If I reacted, he wins. I turned my back to the window, forcing myself to look at the towels. Just finish the pile, I told myself. Just finish the pile and get upstairs. I could feel his eyes boring into my back. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes. Then the tapping started again. But this time, it sounded different. It didn't sound like a fingernail on glass. It sounded duller. There was no clink of the window pane, and it sounded closer. And then I felt it, a firm, deliberate tap. On my left shoulder. I froze. My entire body went rigid. I stopped breathing. The laundry room was huge, and the door to the stairs was all the way across the room. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard footsteps over the dryers. I slowly turned my head to the left. There was no one there. I spun around in a circle, scanning the room, expecting to see the man standing right behind me. "Hello?" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" Nothing but the humming of the dryers and the scent of detergent. I looked up at the window again. The man was gone. The window was empty. I was about to convince myself that I was hallucinating, that the stress and the noise of the machines were playing tricks on me. I looked down at the floor where I had been standing. My blood ran cold. On the gray concrete floor, trailing from the wall underneath the window, were wet, muddy boot prints. They started at the wall, as if someone had walked through the solid concrete, and they ended right behind where I had been standing. The mud was fresh, wet. I didn't scream. I didn't investigate. The flight response took over completely. I dropped the basket of laundry and sprinted for the stairs. I took them 2 at a time, tripping on the way up and scraping my shin on the metal railing, but I didn't stop until I burst into the main lobby, gasping for air. I found the headmaster and told him everything. He was skeptical, of course. He told me it was my imagination, that the old pipes made noises, that shadows played tricks. He sent the janitor down to check, but he came back saying the basement was empty and the windows were locked tight. I refused to go back down there. I took kitchen duty for 3 months straight just to avoid the basement. I warned the other kids, but they just laughed at me. Years later, after the orphanage had closed down, I read a news article about the building being demolished. During the demolition, the construction crew found something behind the basement walls. Apparently, there was an old coal chute and a maintenance tunnel that ran parallel to the foundation. It had been boarded up from the inside decades ago. But when they broke through the wall, they found a small crawl space directly behind the laundry room wall. The boards that sealed it off had been pried loose from the inside. Whoever, or whatever that was, they hadn't come from outside the window. They had been in the walls the whole time, and they had come out just to tap me on the shoulder. And that brings us to the end of tonight's video. I'd like to thank the 3 individuals who submitted these stories. It takes a lot of courage to relive memories like that, especially when they happened in places where you were supposed to feel safe. If you have a true scary story of your own, whether it happened in an orphanage, a hotel, or your own backyard, and you want it featured in a future video, send it to the email address in the description below. Please try to include as much detail as possible. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button, as it really helps the channel out. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.